It seemed to have happened almost overnight. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. Everyone thought it was some elaborate hoax, but we were wrong. Dead.
Are you a zombie obsessive? Do you wish the zombies and everything trend of the late 2000s and 2010s never ended? Do you think that the variety of zombies in Resident Evil was simply, and I quote, not enough zombies? Wish you had to fend off zombies as you walk down to collect your mail in the morning? Well then, have I got a game for you. Quite often, general audiences get the impression that gore and violence in horror films, for instance, is only there for shock value. In the best cases, the gore and violence is there to punctuate a film's higher message. Some films might be truly nasty, but they can still have important artistic statements to make, regardless of whether the director intended that or not, or whether we're capable of sitting through the depravity or not. Some people call these films elevated horror, but I find the term a bit silly. Horror in and of itself isn't low level, and to use the term is to flatten horror, to pigeonhole it. Quite often, also, people use elevated horror to say something about the quality of the work itself, specifically about its level of intelligence. What people often call elevated horror nowadays is really just psychological horror, and the elitist terminology of elevation is often used to make people feel better about liking horror. John Carpenter, the famous director of The Thing, and of course Halloween, says it best: all movies have thematic material. The good ones do. To imply that some aspects of horror are only worth consuming just because they have a more obvious moral or stated connection that you can address is unhelpful, and buries the clever and pertinent messaging behind some nastier films that we can see, that we can read between the lines, even if the intent wasn't there. Just because a work of horror isn't to your personal tastes, and by no means does it have to be, does not mean that it isn't intelligent or has the ability to affect someone quite strongly. This is also not to say that truly nasty films don't exist, because they do. Hollow films stuffed to the gills with vapid violence for the sake of being mean or edgy are plentiful, if you know where to look. But what I am saying is that horror defies such easy categorization for everyone. I saw a review somewhere online, I can't exactly remember where, but someone argued that The Human Centipede 2, a fucking nasty movie actually, and I quote, made them feel something just like all the best films. The debate then about horror categorization is not a simple one, and the stakes can be surprisingly high for some people. So while I concede that elevated horror can be a decent way to catalogue certain films and help audiences find films with similar connections, the wording just makes me feel a little uneasy. Horror is more than capable of standing on its own 2 feet, and is worth enjoying on its own merits, not just because it's categorized as elevated or especially clever. This is all my way of saying that Night at the Gates of Hell doesn't seem to have a lot to say. Instead, it is a nasty, filthy schlockfest, filled with fountains of blood that spray violently from the heads of nasty, oozing, decrepit zombies that shamble endlessly down labyrinthian streets and apartment corridors. There are zombies of all kinds, far too many to list comprehensively. Nun zombies, cultist zombies, radioactive zombies, businessman zombies, ballerina zombies. They just keep coming. But it is this variety of campy zombie action that keeps the game fresh. The game opens with a determined, nasty burst of violence, something to make a statement in the viewer's mind. You begin the game as a bit of a deadbeat misogynist, the same deadbeat who was the boyfriend of the developer's previous game, Bloodwash's protagonist. A jerk just out in the cemetery for some quick sex. The night quickly turns sour as your date for the evening gets her breast ripped off by a freshly raised zombie in a truly grimy scene. Fleeing for your life, you enter a church, but are quickly dismembered by a nun in one of the game's many extremely loud jump scares. While I'm not a huge fan of jump scares that don't really focus on very much suspense, finding the nun takes about a minute or 2, rather than the 5 or so that an exquisite jump scare needs. But instead, just rely on cheap jumps at volume. It is playing true to form by doing this. Like the rest of the game's design, it relies on cheap thrills and a general sense that after you've played it, you're a bit dirtier than you were before you played it. And that's not a bad thing. The low poly nature of the game's graphics really carries the mood, and without it the game would admittedly be much less effective as an experience than it is. Chasing after several different forms of media artifacts, Night at the Gates of Hell emulates, as many games do that are either developed or, as in the case of Gates of Hell, published by Puppet Combo. What these games emulate are both classic horror film and horror game aesthetic, though particularly low-res exploitation flicks. The video nasty genre seems to be what developers Jordan King and Henry Hoare are really pursuing the game's presentation. The game's story seems to be inspired primarily by Lucio Fulci's classic zombie film The Gates of Hell. I say inspired when the plot itself is ripped almost straight from the film. After a death by hanging in a church graveyard, the gates of hell are opened and the dead rise from their graves and begin to overwhelm the world. The aesthetics of the game are very reminiscent of Fulci's gorier scenes. One of the most memorable scenes in the film involves a power drill, while another shows brains being squeezed out of a human's head as their skull is crushed. In the game, everything is run through a disgusting set of filters that makes the whole thing feel itself like a zombie, bloody and shambling, yet somehow still running. The protagonist at Night of the Gates of Hell is such a remarkable badass that his eye is ripped out on screen, and he still fights on. If you find the game too grimy, you can toggle the visual filters to your heart's content, making it cleaner, or even nastier than the default settings should you so wish, if you want to make it harder to play. Sometimes I'll admit that while I love the really horrible, sketchy aesthetics that make it feel like you're playing a video nasty, it really is hard to play that way. Which, I mean, is probably the point, but after about 5 to 10 minutes I just get sore eyes. Normally I played using the PSX filter, which makes the game a bit cleaner, but still airy enough not to lose the feeling of some forbidden game from a dusty cupboard somewhere. If you play horror games for their particular graphical style, Night at the Gates of Hell will probably be one of the most deliberately stylistic titles you'll see on the market at the moment. But it is not good looking in any traditional sense. The zombies are just gross, blocky things, and the humans aren't much better off. As I mentioned before, the game's sound can get quite loud. This is obviously a deliberate design choice, and can be seen in games like Nun Massacre and State of the House, games Puppet Combo developed rather than published. Jordan King and Henry Hoare have constructed a masterful soundscape in many areas that both pushes you on and encourages you to stop and listen to what might be around the next corner. Low, shambling moans, screams of demented zombies of all kinds, the whistling of steam from a pipe, and the satisfying pow of a shotgun gives everything you do in the game weight. I have to admit, none of the game's soundtracks have really stuck with me, but the main menu's ominous chanting sets the scene perfectly for the game to come. And what a game. Night at the Gates of Hell is supremely satisfying to play when you are in the middle of the meaty, tense combat with a zombie. It is classic survival horror gameplay to a T. It plays essentially like a first-person version of the original Resident Evil, where you have a couple of different firearms, a revolver and a shotgun, and a knife item you can pick back up that instantly kills a zombie if it happens to grab you. It's basically a last chance item that lets you keep living even if there's no breathing room. The gun shooting is just incredibly satisfying, with every shot being felt in the sound design and the satisfying recoil, but most of all the gush of ludicrous blood that emerges from the zombie's head to indicate that they've died after a headshot, seemingly the only thing that puts the damn things down. Reloading the revolver is a slow and deliberate process, but the knife slows the gameplay down to a crawl. The first time it is still supremely satisfying since you have that really weirdly engaging spray of blood, but subsequent times you realise that it is the same cutscene, played each and every time as the zombie's head tilts slowly to the side and is stabbed in the eye socket, killing them instantly. Sometimes this is an easier way to dispatch zombies, but it almost makes you feel too safe. It's basically, if you have a knife, you get to see the knife cutscene, and that defeats all the challenge of certain environments. Another really inexplicable thing about the way the game plays is that despite the game's really nasty appearance, as we've discussed, it goes really quite easy on you. I'm a fan of survival horror that pulls few punches and makes sure you feel tense and not at ease throughout almost the whole experience. But Night at the Gates of Hell bursts that tension bubble fairly quickly. I remember stepping out of the character's apartment for the first time, the apartment still occupied by his dead girlfriend, and seeing the absolute desolation of the corridor, fighting off zombies, and learning the mechanics of the game before I was killed for the first time. And I discovered that the game is extremely generous with its checkpointing, to the point that the game was giving me resources for dying. Oftentimes the game felt like it was repeatedly leaving me better off just letting the zombies eat me, getting the free resources, and having to replay about 10 seconds or less of gameplay before steamrolling the encounter that had me genuinely furtive and worried just before as I tried to beat it with limited or half-exhausted resources. That's what I believe the core struggle of survival horror to be all about. So to have such generous checkpointing, well, it took the wind out of my sails a little bit personally. Only the final mission has a checkpoint that takes you right back to the start if you die, and I found that bemusing too. Why come down so hard on the player in the final mission if you've been so lenient up until that point? What doesn't help matters is that I couldn't skip the cutscenes I'd already seen, so I really was a bit disappointed both ways with checkpoints in this game. That's not to say the game ever becomes truly boring. The game shifts up locales frequently, and the variety of zombie types remains interesting and fresh through basically the whole thing. Some of my favourite moments of inventiveness from the game come when you see zombies that aren't so easily killed. Certain zombies have their spines broken, bent back at an unnatural angle, meaning that you can't headshot them so easily. As headshots are the only thing that kills the zombie, you need to think quickly and utilise the space around you effectively, or have damn good aim. Areas are really maximised to their full potential and often set things up quite well in terms of tension, particularly in the earlier areas. I complained about a few scripted jump scares that come off as pretty dull, that zombie nun for instance, but the emergent horror that comes through gameplay is much more effective, and you get moments where you dread having to leave a certain room or having to return somewhere, as you just know that something bad is going to appear between here and there. Some people complain about backtracking, but the early levels are especially good at keeping things from growing stale, even treading down the same corridor again and again. While a later level does get particularly labyrinthian, it still has enough noticeable landmarks that getting lost is actually pretty hard to achieve. And that opening corridor in the apartment is done so well in my opinion, with countless little secrets to uncover. The rooms are often extremely detailed too, rewarding players who like to look around and appreciate things. Some rooms also have some quite nice jump scares to accompany their visuals. Emergent jump scares, I should clarify. Unlocking doors, etc. is a big part of the classic survival horror gameplay rhythm, and Night at the Gates of Hell very much follows that trend. It's hard to think of anything particularly new and inventive that it brings to the table, beyond the sheer variety and insanity of some of the zombies on offer, and again, the satisfying, very, very satisfying shooting. But again, the lack of inventiveness, it's not a bad thing. It's a relatively safe survival horror game, in multiple senses of the word, that intends to challenge and horrify with its visual style, rather than the overwhelming difficulty of its gameplay. However, I would argue, why not try for both? But that's not the game they set out to make. As a zombie shooter, it is infinitely satisfying, but as a survival horror, it's often a little bit too easy, and often isn't quite scary enough to call truly frightening. Suspenseful, sure. Great, well-designed environments, definitely. Awesome zombies, yes. The zombies in the first half, where the game has more claustrophobic environments and environments that also feel a bit closer to home, are often legitimately frightening. Fighting a class of ballerina zombie children is disturbing, haunting, and fun. But for zombie shooter fans, this has to be an instant recommendation, even if with a few caveats. Have you ever experienced a zombie story about the occult? What's that? You have? Well then, you've probably experienced Night at the Gates of Hell's story before. It's pretty by the numbers as far as these things go. What spices it up is the game's sheer oddity, which I think is a good thing for the developers to lean into most of the time. The game features plot elements like an enormous zombie shark, a weird child man person who has a strange obsession with the woman he is following around. A strange obsession. A giant flesh demon. The cultists have a supermax security prison. I could go on a bit, but these are really just tasters for the little bits of weirdness, mixed in with some odd sincerity here and there that you can find in this game. The game also has a few moments of laugh-out-loud hilarity, including this bit was my favourite, that I quite enjoyed during the boat chapter.
So, it looks to me we are about right here.
That's a completely different ocean there, Cap.
Oh.
I cannot believe this. I thought you were a captain. Why haven't you the faintest idea of where we are?
Okay. Since we're all friends now, can I lay down some truth? Fact is, I'm just a cabin boy, okay? The furthest my knowledge goes with directions is that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east.
Rises in the east and sets in the west, Cap.
Fuck!
The game does have a sexual assault joke. Your character passes out at one stage and is captured from the same character. That joke comes off as a little too edgy and unnecessary, but otherwise the tone of the game was strongly, enjoyably weird throughout. It doesn't take itself too seriously, which helps when you consider just how the game doesn't always manage to frighten. I can't think of any scares that really lingered beyond one or two in the apartment complex, and a great bit in the town. The story feels like one that should be quite dark, obviously. Most of the world has been killed by the zombie apocalypse, and only more die as you play through. It doesn't really have any truly emotional beats. It's kind of hard to get attached to anyone in this game beyond the captain, and Stan, who appears also in the developer's previous game, Bloodwash. David, the protagonist, has an effective moment at the end of the apartment where he has to give up his deceased girlfriend, for rather predictable zombie-related reasons, but it's still pretty good. Beyond that, there's not much to recommend from the story beyond a uniquely campy, weird tone. The apocalypse might be happening, but humans are just as eccentric as ever. And just because the game wasn't quite weird enough, Night at the Gates of Hell gives you two lovably eccentric game modes as bonuses for beating the main story. The first, Evil in the House of Dr. Fleshenstein, is essentially a Call of Duty Zombies mode, but with Night at the Gates of Hell's punchy, addictive shooting. You go around unlocking doors with money or spending it on more ammunition. The game is just about defeating waves of zombies and strategizing the best way to survive the waves with the limited ammunition you have. It's fun, funny, and actually quite challenging. It took me quite a while to beat, and makes the best use of the game's shooting mechanics in a controlled environment that is fun to maneuver your way around and learn. Secret passages and walls, places to drop through the floor, and weapons stashed here and there make this a really fun game mode, and a superb reward for finishing the main game. I loved this game mode. The cherry on top was the in-universe reveal that it was some crummy Z movie that Charles just turns off at the end, disgusted by how bad the story was. Fantastic. Then we come to perhaps the strangest horror game I've ever played, at least in terms of its attempted comedic leanings. The Booty Creek Cheek Freak, words I thought I'd never say, is actually surprisingly effective given how silly the whole thing is. As the story goes, one trucker went to use the old bathroom establishment and got stuck on the toilet because of his, and I quote, bodacious buns. Due to the isolation, the man went insane and died of starvation, and according to the legend, if someone takes a dump on the floor in the same bathroom the man died in, the cheek freak will appear and will rip his victim's cheeks off. Now, if that hasn't sold you, I'm actually not sure what else I can say that would interest you. It's weirdly atmospheric at times, despite how absurd everything is. The game builds slowly, letting the forest and the weird campsite creep you out as much as is possible for a game called The Booty Creek Cheek Freak. It's absolutely a parody of other horror titles, but done in a loving and surprisingly effective way. As is typical of horror stories, when you are given warnings by people who evidently know the history of the area, your character somehow manages to take a dump on the floor. Of course. The real game then starts as you have to find a number of bones around the Cheek Freak's lair, a labyrinth of samey-looking corridors, but with just enough detail that learning routes and strategies is not impossible. You have to constantly spray yourself with air freshener, a nice touch, to repel the monster, who, I may note, just in case you hadn't noticed, has an ass for a face, and avoid several jump scares scattered around the strange, surreal environment. It's a surprisingly well-designed environment, but just like the main game, feels slightly on the easy side. I finished it in just 3 goes, whereas I felt it should have been at least a little bit harder than that. But still, the ending was oddly satisfying, watching this crazy monster set on fire and then blow himself up with dynamite. It was the perfect ending to an absolutely mental game. It's not the world's best horror game or anything, but if you like your horror absurd and tongue-in-cheek, I think you'll be more than pleased by this bizarre little curio. All in all, Night at the Gates of Hell is a package that is certainly good value for money, providing you like your horror both grimy and a bit absurd. The shooting mechanics are so satisfying and punchy, it assuredly comes as a recommendation for anyone who likes zombies and shooters. And if you enjoy assuredly mental plots that come with extra mental stories after you finish the main course, I suspect you'll be quite pleased with this strange, fun horror package. Well worth your time. You should play. Hi everyone, hope you enjoyed the review. I'd like to say a huge thank you to my patrons, Frank Alunzi's, Future Cityscape and Blue Voices. Your support makes what I do possible. If you're listening and you're keen on joining too, I'd really appreciate it. Secondly, this is a video that really represents the first experiment of the channel with my video review style. I released it alongside a You Should Play for Mysteries of Lake Ophelia, which is a bit less structured and more freeform. I wrote that review in a generally more fluid way, and I'm curious to know which method was more effective. I also plan to release a long-form video review where the game unfolds throughout the video and where I reflect on it as I play. When that one's released, I can really decide the direction the channel's reviews should go in future. Hope you enjoyed these videos. See you around later. Stay safe everyone.